The sun had barely peeked over the horizon when Officer James Park pulled into the courthouse parking lot, just like he had done every morning for the past 3 years. The familiar smell of his coffee, mixed with the crisp morning air, helped shake off the remaining drowsiness from his 5 a.m. wake-up call. As he adjusted his uniform in the rearview mirror, he couldn't help but smile at the silver badge that gleamed in the early morning light. Being a courthouse security officer wasn't the most glamorous job in the police force, but it was his, and he took immense pride in it. The courthouse was like a second home to him now. He knew every corner, every creaky floorboard, and most importantly, every face that walked through those heavy wooden doors. The morning routine was always the same: check in at the security office, run through the daily briefing with his team, and then head up to Courtroom 7A, where he had been stationed since day one. Courtroom 7A belonged to Judge Richardson, one of the most respected figures in the city's judicial system. She wasn't your typical judge, no Hollywood dramatics or thundering speeches. Instead, she ran her courtroom with quiet authority, earning respect through her fair rulings and no-nonsense approach to justice. Park had watched her handle everything from petty theft to major fraud cases, and her dedication to the law never wavered. Over the years, Officer Park had developed an almost sixth sense about the courthouse and its daily rhythm. He knew which attorneys would rush in at the last minute, coffee in hand and briefcase overflowing. He could predict which days would be busy just by checking the court calendar, and he had mastered the art of spotting trouble before it started, a crucial skill in his line of work. His job wasn't just about standing guard, though that's what most people thought. He was part security officer, part observer, and part human lie detector. He watched the subtle interactions between lawyers and their clients, noticed the nervous tics of witnesses waiting to be called, and kept an eye on the family members who filled the gallery during high-stakes cases. Every day brought new stories, new faces, and new challenges. The other officers often joked that Park had the easiest assignment in the force, standing in an air-conditioned courthouse instead of patrolling the streets. But they didn't understand the unique pressures of his position. One wrong move, one oversight, and the whole judicial process could be compromised. The safety of everyone in that courtroom, from the judge to the court reporter to the newest intern, rested on his shoulders. His partner, Officer Rodriguez, often said Park was born for this job. "You've got the perfect mix," she'd tell him, eagle eyes and endless patience. It was true. Park had a way of staying alert without looking tense, being friendly while maintaining professional distance. He knew how to handle everyone, from angry defendants to stressed-out lawyers, with just the right touch. The courthouse staff had become like an extended family. There was Mrs. Wilson, the elderly clerk who always saved him a morning donut, Mr. Thompson, the building maintenance supervisor who shared fishing stories during lunch breaks, and young Andy from the district attorney's office, fresh out of law school and full of idealistic energy. They were all part of this little world of justice and law that Park had sworn to protect. But what Park appreciated most about his job was watching justice in action. Sure, not every case had a happy ending, and sometimes the system wasn't perfect. But in Judge Richardson's courtroom, he saw genuine efforts to uphold the law fairly and honestly. The judge had earned his respect not just because of her position, but because of her unwavering commitment to doing what was right. As Officer Park settled into his usual spot near the judge's bench that morning, everything seemed normal. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. The familiar sounds of papers shuffling, quiet conversations, and clicking heels filled the air. Little did he know that this ordinary morning would mark the beginning of the most challenging case of his career, one that would test his loyalty, his principles, and everything he believed about justice. Looking back, he would remember this morning as the calm before the storm. But for now, he stood tall and alert, ready for another day of serving justice in his own quiet way. The weight of his badge felt comfortable against his chest, a constant reminder of the oath he had taken to protect and serve, no matter where that duty might lead him. It was a Thursday evening, and most of the courthouse staff had already headed home. Officer Park was finishing up his final security sweep of the building, his footsteps echoing through the empty hallways. The setting sun cast long shadows through the windows, giving the usually bustling courthouse an eerily quiet atmosphere. He'd done this routine hundreds of times before, but something felt different tonight. As he made his way down to the parking garage, he heard the faint sound of voices. This wasn't unusual. Sometimes lawyers worked late or cleaning staff chatted during their evening shifts. But these voices were hushed, almost whispered, coming from a corner of the garage that should have been empty at this hour. Park's instincts, honed by years on the force, kicked in immediately. He slowed his pace, keeping close to the concrete pillars as he moved closer to the source of the voices. The garage's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, creating pools of harsh light between deep shadows. That's when he saw them, two figures standing between a black SUV and the garage wall, deep in conversation. His heart nearly stopped when he recognized one of them as Judge Richardson. She was still in her court attire, but her usual confident posture was replaced by something more guarded, almost nervous. The man she was talking to took Park a moment to place, but then it hit him. It was Mr. Lee, the real estate developer whose fraud case was currently being tried in her courtroom. Park remained absolutely still, his police training taking over. He couldn't hear their exact words, but their body language spoke volumes. The judge was holding what looked like an envelope, and Mr. Lee kept glancing around nervously, like someone who knew they shouldn't be there. Park's mind raced through possible innocent explanations, but each one seemed less likely than the last. He reached for his phone, careful not to make any sudden movements. With steady hands, he managed to take a few photos, making sure to capture both faces clearly in the garage's lighting. The camera's flash was off, but his heart still pounded with every click, afraid the sound might somehow carry across the concrete space. The conversation lasted only a few minutes, but to Park, it felt like hours. He watched as Mr. Lee finally walked away, heading toward his car on the other side of the garage. Judge Richardson remained for a moment, looking down at whatever was in the envelope before tucking it into her briefcase. When she finally moved toward her car, Park could see her hands shaking slightly as she reached for her keys. Once both cars had left the garage, Park let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His mind was spinning with the implications of what he'd just witnessed. This was Judge Richardson, the same person he'd watched deliver countless fair verdicts, the judge who was known for her strict adherence to the law. The same judge who, just that morning, had lectured a young attorney about the importance of ethical behavior in the courtroom. Back in his car, Park sat for a long time, staring at the photos on his phone. The images weren't perfect, garage lighting never is, but they were clear enough to raise questions, clear enough to cause problems, clear enough to potentially end careers, including his own if he handled this wrong. He thought about his options. He could pretend he hadn't seen anything. After all, maybe there was an innocent explanation. Judges and lawyers sometimes had to discuss cases outside of court hours, right? But deep down, he knew this was different. The secrecy, the envelope, the nervous glances, the fact that this meeting happened in a nearly empty parking garage instead of in any of the courthouse's many conference rooms, it all pointed to something very wrong. Park thought about his family, his wife who was so proud of his position at the courthouse, his daughter who wanted to be a police officer just like her dad. He thought about all the times he told her that being a good officer meant doing the right thing, even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. The drive home that night was the longest of his career. The weight of what he'd witnessed sat heavy on his shoulders. He couldn't shake the image of Judge Richardson's face in those moments, not the confident, respected judge he knew, but someone who looked trapped, worried, human. It reminded him that even people in positions of power could make mistakes, could give in to temptation, could fall. That night, he barely slept. He kept replaying the scene in his mind, wondering if he could have somehow misinterpreted what he'd seen. But by morning, he knew what he had to do. As he put on his uniform, the badge felt heavier than usual. Today, he wouldn't just be guarding the courthouse, he would be guarding the very integrity of justice itself. With a heavy heart but a clear conscience, he made the decision to report what he'd seen to Internal Affairs. As he drove to work the next morning, watching the sun rise over the city, he reminded himself that true integrity meant doing the right thing even when, especially when, it meant standing up to the people you respected most. The next 2 months were the hardest of Officer Park's career. Every morning, he put on his uniform, pin his badge to his chest, and head to the courthouse, carrying a secret that felt heavier than his bulletproof vest. The Internal Affairs investigation was moving forward, but for now, everything had to appear normal. Walking into internal affairs that first morning had been nerve-wracking. The office was on the top floor of the police headquarters, and Park remembered how his shoes had seemed unusually loud on the polished floor. Detective Wilson, a seasoned investigator with kind eyes and gray hair at his temples, had listened carefully to Park's account of what he'd witnessed in the parking garage. "You're doing the right thing," Wilson had said, noting how Park's hands shook slightly as he handed over his phone with the photos. "But from here on out, your job gets twice as hard. You'll need to be the best actor in that courthouse." He wasn't kidding. Park had to stand in Judge Richardson's courtroom every day, maintaining the same professional demeanor he'd always had. He watched her conduct trials, hand down sentences, and manage her courtroom with her usual efficiency. But now he noticed things he hadn't before: how certain lawyers seemed more at ease than others, how some cases moved through the system surprisingly quickly, how occasional whispered conversations stopped when he walked by. The investigation team worked carefully, meticulously building their case. They tracked bank records, monitored courthouse security footage, and quietly interviewed court staff. Park became their eyes and ears inside, though it made his stomach turn. He'd note down which lawyers visited the judge's chambers and for how long. He'd document when Mr. Lee or his associates appeared in court. Every detail, no matter how small, could be important. Some days were harder than others, like when Judge Richardson brought in homemade cookies for the court staff, including Park's favorite peanut butter ones. She remembered he loved them from last year's holiday party. Accepting them with a smile while knowing what he knew felt like swallowing sand. His wife noticed something was wrong. "You're not sleeping well," she'd say at breakfast, watching him stir his coffee absently. He couldn't tell her anything, of course, but her worried looks added to his burden. Their teenage daughter noticed too, commenting that Dad seemed extra quiet these days. The evidence kept mounting. Detective Wilson's team discovered a pattern of unusual deposits into offshore accounts linked to shell companies. The amounts weren't huge, that would have been too obvious, but they added up. Each deposit seemed to coincide with certain case outcomes, especially in real estate and development cases. One morning, Park arrived early to find Mrs. Cooper, the elderly court stenographer, crying quietly in the break room. A case she'd transcribed months ago was under review, and she worried she'd make mistakes that led to the investigation. Park had to comfort her while knowing the real reason for the review, and it broke his heart. The hardest part was watching new cases come through. Young public defenders would argue passionately for their clients, believing they were getting a fair hearing. Park wanted to warn them, to tell them the system they believed in so deeply was compromised, but he had to remain silent. Detective Wilson became Park's lifeline during these weeks. They'd meet in out-of-the-way diners or quiet parks, places where courthouse staff wouldn't run into them. Wilson would listen to Park's reports, but also to his doubts and fears. "This kind of case takes a toll," Wilson would say, "because it's not just about catching bad guys, it's about protecting what people believe in." The investigation revealed more players in the scheme. Mr. Lee wasn't the only developer involved. There was a network of business people who seemed to get favorable rulings in exchange for what the team started calling consulting fees. Each discovery made Park feel sick, but also more certain that he'd made the right choice in coming forward. Late one night, as Park was leaving the courthouse, he caught Judge Richardson working late in her chambers. Through the half-open door, he saw her looking at old family photos on her desk, wiping tears from her eyes. For a moment, he almost wavered. She was human too, probably caught up in something that had spiraled out of control. But then he remembered what his father, also a police officer, used to say: "Compassion is important, but justice is necessary." As the case grew stronger, Park noticed changes in the judge. She looked tired, distracted. Her once precise legal arguments became slightly unfocused. It was as if the weight of her secrets was finally becoming too heavy to bear. Park recognized the look. He saw it in his own mirror every morning. The investigation was nearing its end. Detective Wilson's team had gathered enough evidence to move forward. They just needed to plan the arrest carefully, an arrest that would shake the foundations of the courthouse and test everyone's faith in the justice system. As Park headed home that evening, the sun setting behind the courthouse cast long shadows across the parking lot. Tomorrow would bring changes that none of them could take back. As evidence of Judge Richardson's misconduct grew stronger, Officer Park found himself living in two worlds. In one, he was the trusted courthouse officer, nodding respectfully as the judge passed by each morning. In the other, he was a key witness to her corruption, helping build the case that would end her career. The weight of this double life was becoming unbearable. One Tuesday morning, Park watched as Judge Richardson handled a small claims case. A young mother was suing her landlord over unsafe living conditions. The judge listened patiently, asked thoughtful questions, and ultimately ruled in favor of the mother. The woman burst into tears of relief, thanking the judge repeatedly. Park felt his chest tighten. This was the Judge Richardson he'd known and respected for years, the one who could show such compassion and wisdom. But later that same day, he observed her having another private meeting with one of Mr. Lee's associates in their chambers. Through the security cameras he'd helped Internal Affairs install, he watched as another envelope changed hands. The contrast was stark and painful. How could the same person who fought for justice in the morning betray it in the afternoon? The strain began showing in small ways. Park started getting headaches, something he'd rarely experienced before. His appetite disappeared, and his wife noticed he was losing weight. "Maybe you should take some time off," she suggested one evening, watching him push food around his plate. But taking time off wasn't an option. He had to see this through. His fellow officers noticed changes too. Officer Rodriguez, his regular partner, kept asking if everything was okay. "You seem a million miles away sometimes," she said during their lunch break. Park managed a weak smile and blamed it on not sleeping well, but he could tell she wasn't convinced. The lying, even these small lies, ate at him. The hardest moments were during court sessions. Park would stand at his usual post, watching as Judge Richardson presided over cases. He'd see young lawyers fresh out of law school, their idealism still intact, arguing their cases with passion. They believed in the system, in the fairness of the court. Each time, Park felt like he was betraying them by staying silent, yet he knew the investigation needed more time. One day, a retired police officer appeared before Judge Richardson on a minor traffic violation. The old officer had served for 35 years, and the judge treated him with great respect, eventually dismissing the ticket. "It's officers like you who keep our system running," she said from the bench. Park felt physically ill hearing those words, knowing what he knew. At home, his teenage daughter was working on a school project about the justice system. She interviewed Park about his job, asking him what it was like to work with judges and lawyers. "Is it exciting?" she asked, eyes shining with admiration for her dad's role in the courthouse. Park struggled to answer, his throat tight with emotion. How could he explain that sometimes protecting justice meant exposing painful truths? The Internal Affairs team noticed Park's struggle. Detective Wilson pulled him aside after a briefing. "I've seen this before," he said quietly. "When good officers have to investigate people they respect, it takes a toll. There's no shame in finding this difficult." The words helped, but they couldn't erase the knot in Park's stomach. Even the courthouse itself seemed different now. The marble halls that once felt majestic now felt oppressive. The portraits of past judges that lined the walls seemed to watch him with accusing eyes. During his security rounds, he'd find himself standing in empty courtrooms, looking at the judge's bench, wondering how many other secrets these walls held. The breaking point nearly came during a Law Day celebration at the courthouse. Judge Richardson gave a speech about the importance of integrity in the justice system. Park stood at his post, listening as she spoke eloquently about trust, honor, and the sacred duty of legal professionals. The other officers nodded in agreement, but Park had to excuse himself. He rushed to the bathroom, splashed cold water on his face, and stared at his reflection. The face that looked back seemed older, more tired. His father's old police badge sat on his dresser at home, a reminder of why he'd joined the force. Every morning, Park would look at it before putting on his own badge. His father had always said that being a police officer meant standing up for what's right, even when it hurt. Now, those words had a deeper meaning than ever before. The evidence kept building, and with it, Park's certainty that they were doing the right thing. But that didn't make it easier to watch Judge Richardson joke with a court clerk, or praise a young prosecutor for a well-argued case, or show kindness to a nervous witness. In those moments, Park saw not the corrupt judge they were investigating, but the mentor and public servant she had once been. As the investigation neared its conclusion, Park found himself hoping for some last-minute explanation that would make sense of everything. Perhaps there was some bigger picture they weren't seeing, some justification that would explain away all the evidence. But deep down, he knew better. The truth was simple and sad. Power had corrupted, and justice demanded accountability. The case broke wide open on a rainy Tuesday morning. Officer Park was doing his usual security rounds when Detective Wilson called, his voice tight with urgency. "We've got it," he said simply, "the smoking gun we've been waiting for." The evidence came from an unexpected source. A junior accountant at one of Mr. Lee's companies had noticed something odd in the books. Working late one night, she'd discovered a pattern of payments labeled as consulting fees that didn't match any actual consulting work. The amounts were carefully spread out, but they all led back to a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. Park sat in Detective Wilson's office later that day, watching as the detective spread documents across his desk. Bank statements, wire transfers, offshore account details, it was all there in black and white. The latest transfer was the largest yet, $300,000, moved just days before Judge Richardson was set to rule on Mr. Lee's biggest development case. "Look at the timing," Wilson said, pointing to a calendar where he'd marked the transfers in red. "Every major payment lines up perfectly with a favorable ruling in Lee's cases. No one's this lucky in court, not this many times." The money trail was like a connect-the-dots puzzle, each line leading closer to the truth. The shell company had been cleverly set up, but someone had gotten sloppy. Maybe they'd gotten too confident, or maybe they'd gotten greedy. Either way, they'd left just enough breadcrumbs for the investigators to follow. Back at the courthouse, Park watched Judge Richardson with new eyes. She was reviewing evidence in a minor drug possession case, showing her usual attention to detail. But there was something different about her today, subtle signs that only someone who'd watched her for years would notice. Her hands shook slightly as she handled the papers. She kept checking her phone during breaks, something she rarely did. During lunch, Park overheard her talking to her clerk about plans for her grandson's upcoming birthday. She was planning to buy him his first bicycle. The normalcy of the conversation hit Park hard. Here was someone planning for a future that was about to shatter. The internal affairs team worked through the night, making sure every detail was perfect. They couldn't afford any mistakes, not with a case this big. Park provided his final statement, describing everything he'd witnessed over the past months. His words filled page after page, each one another nail in the coffin of Judge Richardson's career. That evening, as Park drove home, he passed by the city park, where he often saw Judge Richardson walking her dog on weekends. She would wave to him sometimes, two public servants sharing a moment of recognition. Now he wondered if she would ever walk there again as a free woman. The weight of what was coming pressed down on him. He thought about all the lives that would be affected, not just Judge Richardson and Mr. Lee, but their families, the court staff, the other judges. The ripples would spread far and wide. At home, his daughter was watching a crime show on TV, one where the good guys always won and justice was served in a neat hour-long package. If only real life were that simple. Park sat with her for a while, listening to her commentary on the show, grateful for this moment of normal family life before everything changed. His wife noticed his distraction during dinner. "Something big is happening at work, isn't it?" she asked quietly after their daughter had gone to bed. Park could only nod. After years of marriage, she knew when he was carrying a heavy burden. She didn't press for details, just squeezed his hand and sat with him in understanding silence. Late that night, Park couldn't sleep. He stood at his window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. Somewhere out there, Judge Richardson was probably in her own home, perhaps enjoying what would be her last few hours of freedom. Did she know what was coming? Did she regret her choices, or had the money made it all seem worth it? The evidence was overwhelming now. Bank records showed a clear pattern of corruption that had gone on for nearly 2 years. Each transfer, each ruling, each secret meeting, it all painted a picture of justice for sale. The judge who had once commanded respect through her integrity had become the very thing she used to fight against. The arrest warrant was ready. Tomorrow morning, everything would change. Park looked at his badge on the nightstand, thinking about what it represented. Tomorrow, he would have to use it not to protect Judge Richardson, but to bring her to justice. The irony wasn't lost on him, the security officer becoming the arresting officer. Detective Wilson's final words from their meeting echoed in his mind. Remember, Park, tomorrow isn't about destroying someone's life. It's about protecting the integrity of justice itself. Park hoped he was right. As he finally drifted off to sleep, he knew that whatever happened tomorrow, nothing at the courthouse would ever be the same. The morning of the arrest arrived with an unusual fog hanging over the city. Officer Park had barely slept, but adrenaline kept him alert as he arrived at the courthouse 2 hours earlier than usual. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a few unmarked police vehicles strategically positioned near the judge's entrance. Detective Wilson and his team gathered in a small conference room for the final briefing. Everyone spoke in hushed tones, aware of the gravity of what they were about to do. Park's hands were steady as he checked his equipment one last time. Handcuffs, radio, badge. Everything had to be perfect. She usually arrives at 7:30, Park told the team, his voice professional despite the turmoil inside. She'll use the private entrance on the east side. She always parks in space 23, has done so for the past 5 years. These small details, so familiar to him after years of service, now felt strange to share in this context. The plan was simple but needed precise timing. They would wait until Judge Richardson was inside the building, but before she reached her chambers. The arrest had to be handled discreetly to maintain order in the courthouse and protect the dignity of the justice system, even as they expose its betrayal. At 7:15, Park took his position near the private entrance. The morning light was just starting to break through the fog, creating an almost theatrical atmosphere. He thought about all the mornings he'd greeted the judge at this very spot, exchanging pleasant good mornings and occasional comments about the weather. His radio crackled softly. Target vehicle approaching. Park's heart rate picked up, but his police training kept him outwardly calm. He could see Judge Richardson's car turning into the parking lot, moving with the same unhurried confidence she always showed. She parked in her usual spot, space 23. Through the fog, Park watched her gather her things. The leather briefcase she'd carried for years, a travel mug of coffee, her phone. Such ordinary actions on such an extraordinary morning. She had no idea that today's routine was about to be shattered. As she approached the entrance, Park stepped forward. "Good morning, Judge Richardson," he said, just as he had hundreds of times before. She looked up with her usual smile, but it froze when she saw his expression. "Is everything all right, Officer Park?" she asked, probably noticing the unusual tension in his stance. Before he could answer, Detective Wilson and 2 other officers emerged from their positions. "Judge Richardson," Park said, his voice firm but not unkind, "I need you to stay where you are." He could see the moment realization hit her. Her eyes widened slightly and her hand tightened on her briefcase strap. "What is this about?" she asked, though Park suspected she knew. Her voice had lost its usual authority, becoming smaller, more vulnerable. Detective Wilson stepped forward, badge in hand. "Judge Richardson, we have a warrant for your arrest." As he began reading the charges, judicial misconduct, accepting bribes, obstruction of justice, Park watched the color drain from her face. The next few moments seemed to move in slow motion. Park had to ask her to put down her belongings. The coffee mug slipped from her hand, spilling across the concrete. The sound of handcuffs clicking into place echoed in the empty parking garage. "Officer Park," she whispered as he secured the cuffs, "I never thought it would be you." The words hit him like a physical blow, but he maintained his professional demeanor. Around them, the courthouse was beginning to wake up. Early arriving staff members stopped in shock at the scene unfolding before them. Someone gasped. Park heard phones being pulled out, photos being taken. By noon, this would be all over the news. As they led her toward the waiting police car, Judge Richardson walked with her head high, though Park could see she was trembling. They passed the wall where her portrait hung among other judges, her painted smile now seeming like a mockery of the moment. The young clerk who usually brought Judge Richardson her morning mail came running up, stopping short at the sight of her handcuffed judge. The stack of papers she was carrying scattered across the floor. Park wanted to help pick them up to offer some comfort, but he had to focus on his current duty. Inside the police car, Judge Richardson looked small and old, nothing like the commanding presence she'd been just yesterday. Park caught a glimpse of her face as Detective Wilson closed the door. She was crying silently, all pretense of dignity finally crumbling. The news spread through the courthouse like wildfire. Park could hear phones ringing everywhere, hushed conversations in corners, shocked exclamations as people learned what had happened. Court staff gathered in small groups, some crying, others angry, many simply stunned. Officer Rodriguez appeared at Park's side as the police car drove away. "You okay?" she asked quietly. Park nodded, not trusting himself to speak. She squeezed his shoulder, understanding without words what this had cost him. The rest of that morning passed in a blur. Park gave his final statement to Internal Affairs, submitted his paperwork, and tried to maintain order in a courthouse thrown into chaos. Every familiar face he saw reminded him of how many lives would be changed by today's events. By afternoon, news vans had gathered outside the courthouse. Reporters asked for statements, cameras flashed, and speculation ran wild. But inside, in the quiet moments between the chaos, Park stood at his usual post, doing his job. Because that's what he'd always done, and what he would continue to do, even when it broke his heart. The weeks following Judge Richardson's arrest felt like aftershocks from an earthquake. Every day brought new revelations, headlines, and changes to the courthouse that had been Park's second home for so many years. The building itself seemed different now, quieter, more subdued, as if the very walls were processing what had happened. The news coverage was intense. Every major network carried the story, and Park couldn't turn on the TV without seeing footage of the courthouse or hearing discussions about judicial corruption. Some reports painted Judge Richardson as a criminal mastermind, others as a victim of circumstance who'd gotten in too deep. The truth, Park knew, lay somewhere in between. The hardest part was facing his fellow courthouse workers. Mrs. Cooper, the elderly stenographer, cried when she learned that transcripts from her courtroom would be used as evidence. "I typed every word of those corrupted judgments," she said during a lunch break, her hands shaking as she held her coffee cup. "I should have noticed something was wrong." Park tried to comfort her, just as he comforted many others in those difficult days. "None of us saw it clearly," he would say. "We saw what we expected to see." It was true. They had all been so close to it, yet so blind to what was happening. The investigation expanded like ripples in a pond. Mr. Lee and several other developers were arrested. Law firms were scrutinized. Other judges' records were reviewed, though no other corruption was found. Each new arrest or revelation brought reporters back to the courthouse steps, their cameras flashing like lightning in a storm. At home, Park's family dealt with their own challenges. His daughter faced questions at school. Some kids thought it was cool that her dad had arrested a judge, others were less kind. His wife fielded calls from curious neighbors and worried relatives. Through it all, they stood by him, proud of what he'd done, but understanding the toll it had taken. One morning, about a month after the arrest, Park found an envelope in his locker. Inside was a letter from a young lawyer whose first case had been in Judge Richardson's courtroom. "I lost that case," the letter read, "and now I know why. Thank you for showing us that justice is more than just a word on the courthouse wall." The letter touched him deeply, but it also reminded him of all the cases that needed to be reviewed. A special task force was set up to examine every ruling Judge Richardson had made in the past 2 years. It was painstaking work, but necessary to restore faith in the system. Some days, Park would arrive early and sit in the empty courtroom where he'd stood guard for so many years. The judge's bench seemed to loom larger now, a reminder of both the power it represented and how that power could be misused. The morning sun would stream through the high windows, dust motes dancing in the light, while he reflected on everything that had happened. His relationship with other police officers changed too. Some treated him with new respect, others with a hint of wariness, as if worried he might be watching them too closely. But most understood that he'd simply done his job, even when that job had become incredibly difficult. The city's legal community was in turmoil. Law firms that had won cases in Judge Richardson's court faced scrutiny. Some lawyers left the profession entirely, disillusioned by what had happened. Others became fierce advocates for judicial reform, determined to prevent similar corruption in the future. Park received a commendation for his role in the investigation, though the ceremony was kept low-key at his request. "I didn't do this for recognition," he told Detective Wilson. "I did it because it was right." Wilson nodded, understanding perfectly. "That's exactly why you deserved it," he replied. 6 months after the arrest, Park was promoted to the department's Public Integrity Unit. His experience made him valuable in teaching other officers how to spot corruption and maintain their integrity under pressure. He spoke to police academy classes about what he'd learned, sharing the human side of difficult decisions. Judge Richardson's trial was scheduled for the following spring. Park would be a key witness, and he spent hours preparing his testimony with the prosecution team. Each preparation session brought back memories, some painful, some bittersweet. But he knew his testimony was crucial to ensuring justice was served. 1 year to the day after the arrest, Park stood in front of a group of new courthouse security officers. They looked at him with respect, knowing his story. "Your job isn't just about protecting a building," he told them. "It's about protecting the idea of justice itself. Sometimes that means making hard choices, but integrity isn't about doing the easy thing, it's about doing the right thing." The courthouse had changed in many ways, but its fundamental purpose remained the same. New safeguards were put in place, oversight was increased, and transparency became a priority. Park saw these changes as positive steps, though he never forgot the cost at which they came. Late one evening, as Park was leaving work, he ran into Mrs. Cooper again. She was retiring after 30 years of service. "You know," she said, adjusting her glasses, "what happened here was terrible, but some good came from it too. People trust the system more now because they know someone's watching out for them. That someone is you, Officer Park." He drove home that night thinking about her words. The sunset painted the courthouse in golden light, making it look almost like it had in the days before everything changed. Park knew things would never be quite the same, but maybe they could be better. After all, true justice isn't about perfection. It's about the constant struggle to do what's right, even when it hurts, even when it costs you something precious. His badge still gleamed on his chest, catching the last rays of sunlight. It meant something different to him now, not just authority, but responsibility. The responsibility to protect not just people, but principles. To stand guard not just over a building, but over the very idea of justice itself.